We see this idea emerging through Christian history, being emphasized in the Reformation. In a way I'll talk about in a moment, science, in the way we understand it today, is based on faith-based assumptions, so that even the scientist practicing today, whether he or she realizes it or not, is actually operating in a Christian framework which, if you were to remove it, modern science would come to an end. If you look at values that even secular people cherish, the value of individualism, that the individual matters, the social value of compassion. If somebody is suffering, you should feel for him or her, you should do something to alleviate that. Have you noticed that when there's a big famine or tsunami or catastrophe, the Western nations of the world all rush to help? And this seems natural to us. People don't think twice about it. It's the way we are. But it's not the way that human nature is. And the proof of that is that when tsunamis happen, other people in other cultures don't seem to react in the identical way. They react, if you will, with the philosophy expressed by the Russian proverb, "The tears of strangers are only water." In a way, the Russians are very much in a Darwinian tradition, by which I mean the idea that as surviving beings in a dog-eat-dog world, we should help those who are closely related to us. We should help our family, we should help our neighbors, we should help our tribe, but why on earth should we even put ourselves out for a guy who is nothing to us? Christianity introduces this notion and universalizes it, that we, in a sense, are all in this together, and we owe. Now, if you go back to ancient Greece and Rome, there was a virtue, not compassion. Aristotle actually scorns the idea of compassion. Aristotle celebrates liberality or magnanimity. Magnanimity is a demonstration of the superior man showing his greatness in deigning to help the lesser man. Magnanimity exists within a structure of inequality. It's very different from the notion of sympathy or compassion. We're all in this together. Let me talk, if I may, about the issue of equality. I was reading in Sam Harris's book, "The Christians have got to bear some responsibility for the institution of slavery. Didn't the Christians compromise with slavery for centuries?" and so on. Well, we have to remember that slavery was a universal institution. It existed in every society known to man. The Chinese had it, the Asian Indians had it, there were slaves in the Americas before Columbus got here. In a way, slavery for centuries was uncontroversial. It did not need any defenders because it had no critics. It was kind of like the family. Christianity is the first institution in the world that made slavery controversial. Christianity is the first movement in the world to create and lead an anti-slavery movement. First the Quakers and then the evangelical Christians basically said this. They said, look, we learn from our faith that all men are equal in the eyes of God. And for centuries, this was seen as a spiritual insight. It applied to the next world, but not necessarily to this world. But the Quakers and the evangelical Christians said, if we are all equal in the eyes of God, it follows that no man has the right to rule another man without his consent. And this idea became the foundation not only for anti-slavery, not only for the abolition movement, it also became the moral foundation of democracy. Democracy, too, is based on the principle that no man has the right to rule another without consent. So Christianity here becomes, if you will, the soil out of which the anti-slavery movement, representative democracy, grows. And that's why these things happened in the West and nowhere else. They could be exported abroad later, but they started in this civilization and no other. Now ask yourself this question: why is modern science a Western idea? In other words, if you go to other cultures, you have intellectual curiosity. The Mayans develop a calendar, the Chinese recorded the eclipses, the Hindus invented the number 0, but science, in the structure that we have it today, as a kind of institution, science seems to have developed not in every civilization, but in this one. Why? I want to suggest that the reason it did is science is based ultimately on an assumption that can only be described as theological. In fact, not one, but three theological premises, all derived from Christianity. Premise number one, the universe as a whole is rational. The universe as a whole follows laws. Now, this may seem very obvious to you if you've taken a physics class and you go, well, yeah, so? But the point is, it's not obvious. In fact, there is no necessity that it should be so. The Muslim thinker Al-Ghazali says that the universe exists in the mind of God. God intervenes at every single second to make everything that happens. It's not a question of law, it's a question of divine governance of everything that occurs. But no, modern science is based on the notion of a regular, an orderly, a lawful universe. Second, modern science is based on the idea that the rationality of the universe is comprehensible in the language of mathematics. If you think about it, this is a little bit odd. We know that human beings can act purposefully or lawfully, but how does the electron know what to do? How do inanimate objects know how to follow rules? And what rules? Newton's inverse square law, Einstein's rules. We have matter behaving as if it was purposeful, as if it was following a pattern or a program. So the universe is rational, it follows the rules of mathematics, and third, the rules of the universe are comprehensible to us. We can figure them out. That's odd if you think about it as well. Why should the neurons working in your head match and somehow be able to capture the rationality of the world out there? Now, as a Christian, I can answer those questions theologically. The universe is rational because it mirrors the rationality of God. It follows rules because the Creator is lawful and chose to make that kind of a universe. It is accessible to us because we have a stamp of the divine image, if you will, a mark of divine rationality in us, and therefore it's no surprise under a theological assumption that there is a sort of correspondence between the rationality out there and the rationality in here. But my point is that if you're an atheist, you have no way of knowing any of those things. Let's take a simple example. It is a premise of science that the laws of the universe follow a pattern of universality. For example, the speed of light, as measured, is considered to be the same everywhere in the universe. If I measure the speed of light in this room, 186,000 miles a second. I measure it on Jupiter, 186,000 miles a second. I assume that if I were to go to a star 5,000 light years away, the speed of light would be the same. Do I know that? Have I measured it? No. I assume it. I presume it. It is my operating model. Again, if you are a theist, you can say, well, yes, God has essentially ordained laws, and these laws are consistent, they're universal. But if you're an atheist, you don't know it. You are guessing. You are making this stuff up. You are operating, if you will, on theological assumptions, whether you are man enough to admit it or not. Now, not surprisingly, most of the great scientists of the past 5 centuries have been religious. Most of them, in fact, have been Christians. This is true of Boyle, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, the list goes on. And not only were they Christians, which right away, by the way, should give you pause when you hear the arrogant claims of people like Dawkins, and Dawkins is supposed to be the leading publicizer of science in the world. But Newton was the leading doer of science in the world. And Newton not only saw no contradiction between his faith and science, but even more, these great scientists saw their work as motivated by and leading to a discovery of the divine handiwork in the universe. A good example of this would be Kepler. When Kepler did his work, he discovered that the planets don't seem to be moving in perfect circles. And the theologian said to him, well, wouldn't God use the perfect image, which is the circle? And Kepler said, you know what, I'm pretty convinced that whatever pattern God used, when I just discover it, I will show you it is a far more beautiful, intricate, symmetrical, and ingenious pattern than you have thought of. And this, in fact, motivates my work to discover that pattern. And when Kepler laid out his 3 laws, he said very beautifully and very piously, this is ultimately the reflection of the handiwork of God. I've talked a little bit about science, a little bit about history, and I want to turn to a very common argument made on the other side, which is an argument made against Christianity and against religion, which is, isn't it true that for all its accomplishments, even if you admit them, that Christianity is responsible for a lot of the crimes and violence of the world, the violence of history, and moreover, if we look at the problems in the world today, from Northern Ireland to 9/11, we see that religion appears to have a pretty nefarious role in the world. I want to try to answer this argument in a rational way. First of all, as I look around the world, I see a lot of people fighting, and to the naive glance, it appears to be that they're fighting about religion. But if you look a little more closely, you see right away that they're not. Why are the Israelis and the Palestinians fighting? Are they fighting about whether Moses or Muhammad was a greater prophet? No. They're fighting over a piece of land that they both think belongs to them. Why are the Hindus and the Muslims fighting? They're fighting over Kashmir, not over religion. In Northern Ireland, they're fighting over identity and self-determination and self-rule. There's a joke about a guy in Belfast as he steps out of his apartment. A guy jumps behind him and says, pointing a gun to his head, "Catholic or Protestant?" And the guy says, "Actually, I'm an atheist." And the man says, "Catholic atheist or Protestant atheist?" But if you think about it, the point of the joke is, it's not really about religion. I think one of the things that the new atheists have done is to cunningly look at the crimes committed by the Islamic radicals in the name of Islam and to try to foist those same crimes on Christianity. Even if you look at history, you look at the Crusades. Well, the Crusades were a response to Muslim invasion and Muslim conquest. The Middle East was mostly Christian before the Muslims came along. They conquered it. Islamic armies came into Europe. They conquered parts of Italy, all of Spain. They overran the Balkans. They were at the gates of Vienna. Even Gibbon, no friend of Christianity, says that if the Christians hadn't blocked Muslim irredentism, today most of us would all be attending universities in which we'd be reading the Quran in the Arabic language. In other words, the Crusades were a necessary, although clumsy and ultimately only partially effective, way to block Islamic invasion and conquest. The Inquisition. I read Henry Kamen's book of his authoritative study of the Inquisition. I discovered the number of people killed in the Inquisition over 3 centuries, 2,000. I read a book on the Salem witch trials, a scholarly study, the number of people put to death in Salem, 18.